And so this allowed the elite to dominate the state. Wiley Branton, the great civil rights attorney from Pine Bluff. If you don't know about Wiley Branton, you really should. He was one of the foremost civil rights attorneys of the modern civil rights movement. He became dean of Howard University Law School, just a tremendously important figure in the civil rights movement. He's from Pine Bluff. And this is what he said about how voting was done on plantations in Pine Bluff in the 1940s, or around Pine Bluff. These plantation owners and others would line up tenants and sharecroppers on election day and have them go through the little voting place without doing anything. And they would just check them off, and the clerks would vote for them. This is how elections were done in Arkansas in the 1940s, the 1950s, in which the votes of working people were overwhelmed by these votes of planters, county bosses, and industrialists. And this leads to, I mean, this state in which concerns of working people were largely ignored. All of this started to change during World War II. World War II, through the intervention of the federal government, actually empowers the working class, both white and black. And World War II is this moment in which workers in the state, both white and black workers, and African Americans as a group come together to challenge the dominance of the economic elite. And to understand this, we have to realize that World War II is when industry comes to Arkansas. Before World War II, Arkansas was one of the most agricultural states in the Union. Arkansas was tied with the Dakotas and Nebraska for the percentage of the most people who were dependent upon farming. There was little industry in the state because, well, there was no capital, there was no infrastructure, and there was no skilled workforce. And what happens during World War II? The need for war material, the need for weapons to fight the Nazis in Imperial Japan. It means that the federal government comes in and makes investments. It provides the capital, it provides the workforce training, and it provides infrastructure to bring industry to Arkansas. And this is extremely important because with industry, you have organized labor. The federal government, in order to keep peace during the war, encourages workers to join unions, and they force employers to recognize those unions and bargain collectively. As part of the war, organized labor supports something called the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC. And what the FEPC does is it makes it illegal for those who receive federal contracts to discriminate on the basis of race. And so black workers have to be offered jobs at defense establishments. And what we see in Arkansas is during the war, organized labor, the AFL-CIO, the AFL unions, the CIO unions, the teachers unions begin to take hold. And they begin to accumulate a little bit of power and a little bit of clout, and they begin clamoring against elite dominance. Additionally, World War II saw the rebirth, the re-energizing of the civil rights movement. As soon as the war was on the horizon, civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who's also a labor leader, they saw opportunity. And these civil rights leaders, they look back at the nation's the Black experience during World War One. And they said during World War One, the Black civil rights leadership said we have to put aside our our own racial grievances for the duration of the war. And if we do that, we'll be rewarded at the end. As many of you know, that did not happen. What you see at the end of the war is a widespread outbreak of racial violence and the mass murder of Black folks, whether it's in Elaine, down in Phillips County, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in Omaha, whether it's all across the nation. And so when World War II comes, Black leaders, civil rights leaders said, we're not going to fall for that again. And they announced what is called double V campaigns. They were mobilizing the Black folks, the Black community, their Black constituents for victory over fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home. And so they equated improvement in domestic civil rights with the fight against fascism. Most famously, A. Philip Randolph led the March on Washington movement that led to, in 1941, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, where the federal government basically says if you receive a federal contract for the war, you cannot discriminate against African Americans or Mexican Americans. The signal, this is the beginning. This is the first major law that energizes the modern civil rights movement. Additionally, during the war, as part of this fight against fascism abroad and Jim Crowism, the NAACP wins a case out of Texas called Smith v. Allwright that forbids the all-white Democratic primary. Because as most of you know, in much of South during this time, the Democratic Party was the only party. Just like the Republican Party is almost the only party we have today. In the 1940s, the Democratic Party was the only party. And the Democratic Party prevented African Americans from voting. And that meant African Americans had no voice, had no vote. And after 1944, the Democratic Party in Arkansas had to allow Black folks to vote. And this is a wartime measure. And so the war, what it does for the first time through the intervention of the federal government, it empowers working people, both Black and white, as workers who are joining unions. And these unions are challenging the state's elite for dominance. Additionally, African American groups, civil rights groups, as a racial groups, they are also challenging elite dominance. They're challenging Jim Crow. They're challenging disfranchisement for the first time. And organized labor and African Americans started working together. Oh, by the way, here's a slide. This is the Pine Bluff Arsenal. I mentioned that the war brought industry to the state, and the Pine Bluff Arsenal is one example. 10,000 industrial jobs in Jefferson County. But you can look at the Schumacher Naval Missile Factory in Camden, which is still in operation today, employed 8,000 people. In El Dorado, you have defense plant after defense plant. In Jacksonville and Little Rock, you have ordnance plants. In Fort Smith, this is when industry comes to the state. And because of the Fair Employment Practices Committee, Commission, you have Black workers working industrial jobs. And what this means is that these workers are no longer tied to a plantation owner. Their employment is bureaucratic rather than personal. Nobody who runs the Pine Bluff Arsenal is monitoring what these workers do once they leave the job. And that frees these workers to join things like the NAACP, civil rights groups. Instead of living on credit, they're now being paid in cash, and they can buy poll taxes. And so it's hard to overstate the importance of industrialization for the civil rights movement in Arkansas. But what we see is that organized labor, white workers, Black workers in unions, along with civil rights organizations, launch a national campaign to abolish the poll tax. You can see it in Arkansas. You can see it in the rest of the South. You can see it across the nation. Organized labor, Black civil rights groups, they understood that the poll tax was the key to elite dominance of the state, of the planters and the industrialists using the state government to benefit simply the rich. And this national campaign to abolish the poll tax. By the way, in case you didn't realize it, this is Dr. Seuss cartoon. Yes, Dr. Seuss was woke in 1942, trying to get rid of the poll tax. It didn't work during war, and it didn't work because conservative Southern Democrats kept filibustering in the Senate to prevent passage of legislation to abolish the poll tax. And when the poll tax continues, it gives the elite who are running the state, the planters, the corporate leaders, it gives them more time. And what we also see is that the elite, the planter class, the industrialist class, the bankers and the lawyers who run the state, they see this activism by organized labor. They see this activism by civil rights groups, and they are shocked. They are scared. And what they do is they start passing legislation designed to curtail labor unions, and they do it in the name of white supremacy. I'm a historian, so I tell stories. Over in eastern Arkansas, the land of cotton, in the Delta, plantation owners after the Civil War regularly employed violence to keep sharecroppers and tenants in their place. And we see this in 1891 in Lee County. A group of Black cotton pickers go on strike. They demand $1 a day. This strike leads to basically the lynching of 20 Black men. In 1919, in Phillips County, southern Phillips County, at Elaine, sharecroppers, tenant farmers organized their own union. And the organization of this union in Phillips County is met with violence. Somewhere between 200 and 450 African-American sharecroppers and tenant farmers are killed, murdered, hunted down in a 3-day orgy of violence called the Elaine Massacre. And so there's this long history of these Eastern Arkansas planters employing mass violence against Arkansas workers. And then in the 1930s, what you see is a new type of sharecroppers union. It's called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. It's created in 1934 in Poinsett County. And what the Southern Tenant Farmers Union does that is unique is it brings white sharecroppers and white tenants and black sharecroppers and black tenants together into a single union. This is the beginning of this biracial unionism. And because there are white workers in this union, it's much more difficult for planters to employ mass violence. Additionally, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union has powerful friends in Washington, D.C., has powerful friends in New York City. And so the planters cannot employ mass violence in the Delta anymore to stop sharecroppers and tenant farmers from organizing. And so what they do is they bring in, there's a picture of the guy on your left, the guy on the far left, his name is Vance Muse. And Vance Muse is a reactionary. He's a political operator. His great-grandson once wrote that he was a white supremacist, an anti-Semite. And he beat on labor unions just so he could get big checks from employers. He was just a nasty individual. Arkansas planters bring him in 1943 to pass what they call the anti-labor violence law. It's not an anti-labor violence law. It's a measure that made strikers, but not strike breakers or management, criminally liable for any violence that occurs during labor disputes. And Vance Muse said this law will allow peace officers to quell disturbances and keep the color line drawn in our social affairs. And basically what this law did is it basically gave strikebreakers the license, the ability to legally beat up, kill any strikers. So in the anti-labor violence law actually encouraged violence against strikers, violence that benefited. And this becomes state law. It's on the books today. And the following year, Vance Muse, at the behest of Arkansas planters, engineers passage of the first Right to Work Amendment. The Right to Work Amendment prohibits unions and employers from negotiating contracts with closed shop provisions. And at the time, Vance Muse said, if this amendment fails, white women and white men will be forced into organization with black African apes, who they will have to call brothers. Right to work in Arkansas. Arkansas, the first right to work law, 1944. It was designed to keep working class blacks and working class whites from coming together to challenging the prerogatives of the state's economic elites. After passage of the Right to Work measure in 1945, Vance Muse goes to a national reporter, and he explains in no uncertain terms that the Right to Work measure was designed to keep black people in their place. He uses language I am not going to repeat here, but right to work in Arkansas has deeply racist origins. It's also anti-Semitic in this odd way that I can talk about later if anyone has questions. And so what you see during the war, during World War II, the federal government, it energizes the labor movement. Black union members, white union members coming together and demanding change. The federal government also empowers African American civil rights groups. It gives them the ability to find jobs, to find jobs that are not related to agriculture, to form their own organizations, to be paid in cash so that Black people can buy poll tax receipts. All of these things are going on. And after the war, these African American groups and these labor groups come together and form a political alliance that is dedicated to taking power away from the elite. Daisy Bates talks about it in her autobiography. Wiley Branton in oral history interviews talks about this alliance. And so I want to talk about how it started. The place to begin to understand this Black labor political alliance is in Little Rock. In downtown Little Rock, if you guys know where the Clinton Library is, if you know where the Democrat Gazette building, over in that neighborhood was the Southern Cotton Oil Mill. And the Southern Cotton Oil Mill, what it did is it was owned by Swift and Wesson Shortening Company. Most shortening, snowdrift shortening, Crisco shortening is basically cottonseed oil that is whipped up. And by the 1940s, the processing of cotton seeds is the most profitable part of cotton agriculture. That the seeds are crushed, they're made into oil, and then the oil becomes Crisco or snowdrift shortening. And there was a crushing mill in Little Rock. And during, it dates to the 1920s. And during World War II, the men who worked there, who were overwhelmingly African American, they formed a union. It's part of something called the FTA, the Food, Tobacco, and Agricultural Workers Union. By the way, it's one of the reddest unions out there, the most radical unions. And during the war, the company and the union signed a contract. When the war was over, the company sought to break the union, to bust the union. And in 1945, in December, the company rejected offers to negotiate, rejected federal offers to mediate a labor dispute at the company, and provoked a strike. The strike was peaceful for the first several days. Only family members, people of upstanding in their communities were allowed to walk the picket line. And then on December 26th, on December 26th, 1945, a strike breaker, a man who had been in state prison, a man who had a violent past, confronted a striker and stabbed him 20 times, left him for dead on 9th Street. And according to Elsie Bates, the civil rights editor, the striker was set up. It was intentional, premeditated murder of the striker. But what happens is the county prosecutor says that the strike breaker was acting in self-defense and then goes and arrests everyone on the picket line for violating the anti-labor violence measure that was enacted in 1943. And you can see these men's pictures here, Roy Cole and Robert Brooks, and they were arrested. They were 75 yards away from where the violence had occurred. Their union brother was murdered. According to Elsie Bates, it was premeditated murder, and they were arrested for the crime. They were taken before a court in Little Rock, a hand-picked jury, and they were sentenced to hard time in the penitentiary. What this strike does is it, when these men are sentenced to the penitentiary, the civil rights groups, especially those in Little Rock, they mount this huge campaign. They say these men are being persecuted and prosecuted unjustly because they are Black men who are standing up and demanding higher wages, better working conditions. They are demanding that they be treated like human beings. The labor movement, unions, look at this and they say these are union men walking a picket line on strike. And the state of Arkansas is letting strike breakers come and kill strikers. And then, on top of that, trying to put other union members in prison for that crime. If you read Daisy Bates's autobiography, Shadow over Little Rock, she spends a lot of time talking about this case. It was this pivotal moment in Little Rock's history, both its labor history and its civil rights history. This energizes the Black Labor Alliance. And this Black Labor Alliance is built around the idea of labor liberalism. And this Black Labor Alliance in Little Rock and in Arkansas is built around the idea that working people deserve high wages. If you pay working people high wages, they will spend that money, and that consumer demand will become the engine that drives the economy. Right now, in 2024, about 70% of our nation's economic activity is driven by consumer spending. So what these labor liberals were saying is, you need high wages so people buy stuff, and when people buy stuff, factories work. It's good for the entire economy. Labor liberalism, generous welfare benefits, senior citizens, women, infants, SNAP benefits, food stamps for the poor. Those things are needed to provide opportunity for every American. A progressive tax structure, that the wealthiest people should pay the highest percentage of taxes. By the way, what do wealthy people do with their money? They save it. And when they save the money, they are not spending it. You need people to spend money to stimulate economic activity. Strong labor movement. Only the labor movement can bring people together to challenge corporate power. It's as simple as that. If there's no strong labor movement, corporations get to dictate what governments do. And so this guy on your right is Sidney McMath. He was governor from 1949 to 1952. He was the state's leading labor liberal. He brought together civil rights groups, labor organizations. After he leaves the governor's office in 1952, he and his best friend, Henry Woods, become the attorneys for the Arkansas AFL-CIO. They also become cornerstones of the Arkansas Civil Rights Movement. And so this labor liberalism, um, Black organizations, civil rights organizations, unions coming together behind labor liberalism to challenge the elite dominance of Arkansas's economy, its governmental system. And it starts having successes. In 1946, first election in which African Americans can actually vote in the Democratic primary. African American groups and union groups come together, and they defeat the guy who prosecuted the Southern Cotton Oil Mill strikers. And they elect a guy named Edwin Dunaway. And Edwin Dunaway becomes a prominent liberal in the post-war era. In 1948, African-American groups, labor groups, come together and elect Sidney McMath governor. The guy he defeated, Holt, was a white supremacist. In 1948, a couple months after the governor's election, there's a presidential election in which Strom Thurmond is running for president as a segregationist. It's called the Dixiecrat Revolt. And Arkansas is one of the southern states that rejects Strom Thurmond. Louisiana votes for him, Alabama, Mississippi, but Arkansas, because of these civil rights groups, because of these union groups, because of Sidney McMath, makes sure the Dixiecrats go down to defeat. In 1953, the National Labor Movement, both the AFL and the CIO, begin sending money to Arkansas so that civil rights leaders can buy poll taxes in bulk. You send $500 to civil rights groups in Pulaski County, $1,000, or to Sebastian County or Jefferson County, and the civil rights leaders would buy poll taxes to allow Black people. In 1954, this Black Labor Alliance elects Orville Faubus governor and a guy named Tom Gentry attorney general. Yes, Faubus was elected by a coalition of labor unions and Black folks. Daisy Bates talks about that in her autobiography. Faubus turns, Gentry doesn't, and that's why you've never heard of Gentry. He gets pushed to the sidelines. 1955, African Americans groups and unions elect Woodrow Wilson Mann mayor of Little Rock. 1956, because of Mann, because of things going on in Little Rock, the bus company in Little Rock is union owned, and it integrates in March of 1956. Little Rock is the first major southern city to run buses without Jim Crow signs. And it is a result of this labor Black political alliance. And in 1956, this labor Black political alliance puts a amendment to abolish the poll tax on the November ballot. And what this coalition wants to do is they want to open up Arkansas to working class voting. They said, if we get more people vote, the more people we have voting, the more democratic Arkansas is, and the less Arkansas is dominated by the rich. And so the poll tax is not that measure in 1956 falls. It fails because largely it gets caught up in massive resistance to school integration. And the crisis at Central High. If you talk to, or if you listen to, he's dead now, the head of the Arkansas AFL-CIO at the time, he said, this movement, this massive resistance movement, is financed by industrialists and planters to get white people, white workers and black workers hating each other so that they don't come together to challenge the planters, the corporate interests in the state. And he says it nearly worked. That the Central High crisis, that other segregationist crises through the state, nearly tore the labor movement apart. And he says that was what was designed to do. But the president of the AFL-CIO at the time, Arkansas, it was a guy named Odell Smith, and he was a Teamster. And he was like me, just bald head, kind of grumpy white guy. But he was simply amazing. He was an integrationist, but he knew if he came out too strongly for integration, that white members would just quit their unions. And so what he had to do was to coerce, not entice white union members, many of which were segregationists, into continuing this Black labor alliance. And he does this by talking about class. He does this by talking about the tenets of labor liberalism. And he finds that the rank and file, especially white members, are divided on segregationists. And what happens? Building trades are segregationists, industrial unionists are more likely integrationists. And Smith walks a tricky line. He opposes Faubus on economic grounds. And Faubus responds by saying that there's two organizations that hate him: NAACP and the AFL-CIO. And he campaigns in 1958 against the Arkansas AFL-CIO. He says, Odell Smith, Arkansas AFL-CIO, they want to make Daisy Bates the monarch of the state. And that's how he wins re-election. And Odell Smith walks this tricky line, but he keeps the labor movement together in spite of all odds. The Arkansas AFL-CIO continues to buy poll tax receipts for African-American activists. It opposes Faubus, citing his support for states' rights. And he's biding his time. And finally, what happens is in 1958, Odell Smith and the labor movement come out forcefully. In 1958, one of Faubus's rivals, a guy named Jim Johnson, is often called Justice Jim in our state. He was a rabid segregationist. And he puts a states' rights amendment on the November ballot. And this states' rights amendment creates a state sovereignty commission that has its own budget with broad, unappealable powers. And what Johnson wants to do is to create the State Sovereignty Commission that is beyond the reach of the court systems and the legislature to oversee secrecy voting. And Jim Johnson hopes that this state sovereignty commission will eliminate black voting in Arkansas. And Jim Johnson puts this on the November ballot, this amendment. And the Arkansas AFL-CIO launches the campaign to defeat it. And the Arkansas AFL-CIO is successful. Odell Smith, the leaders of the Arkansas AFL-CIO, go to the national labor unions and they ask for money. They go to Detroit, and the United Auto Workers and the Ruther brothers just start sending checks, piles of money to Arkansas to rally voters against the states' rights amendment. They hold rallies, they challenge the amendment in courts, and they win. The Arkansas Supreme Court says Jim Johnson's amendment cannot appear on the ballot. The Teamster attorney, Tom Gentry, he's former attorney general of the state of Arkansas, wins. And what organized labor does in 1958 is it defeats the most serious attempt to restrict black voting in Arkansas history. And this, as much as anything else, helps cement this black labor political alliance. The Arkansas AFL-CIO, Arkansas Education Association, women's groups, civil rights groups come together in 1958 to reopen Little Rock's high schools that had been closed by segregationists. And the AFL-CIO says, look, when you close high schools to avoid racial integration, it hurts poor kids. Rich kids can go to private schools. Poor kids need public schools. And the Arkansas AFL-CIO funds the Open School campaign in 1959. By the way, AEA is part of this. Forrest Roselle is at every meeting. AEA is contributing money to this, but Forrest Roselle, and it's in the minutes of the Arkansas AFL-CIO, Forrest Roselle of AEA is saying, I can't be public on this because FOBUS will cut teacher salaries if I am. But the AEA is part of this. They're pushing the Open Schools Alliance. And this brings, again, helps cement civil rights groups, labor organizations, AFL-CIO, AEA, and other liberal groups. And this becomes the basis of labor liberalism in the state of Arkansas. In 1960, the same coalition defeats a state ballot initiative that would remove the requirement that students be offered a public school education. Segregationists wanted that removed to avoid integration of schools. But civil rights groups, labor groups, their liberal allies defeat this. 1962, they pushed through a measure to provide voting machines and secret ballots. Black activists, labor activists, their liberal allies start endorsing slates of candidates in the Democratic primaries. And they begin working together. And this is the emergence of labor liberalism. What time is it? Can we take a 5-minute break right now?
I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah, can we come back in 5 minutes? I think this is a good time to take a break.
All right, 5 minutes. That'd be 10:08, my friends. 10:08.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay.
Michael, are you going to have some time at the end of yours to take questions from
I,
the participants?
I hopefully I will.
Okay.
I'd be happy to. It's always weird lecturing on Zoom because you can't see the audience, and
Right,
so
right.
it's
They're not,
it's
yeah.
it's alienating. Um, and so
Hopefully next year we'll be back in person.
back in person, yeah. My Zoom skills have gotten rusty
Oh, you're
since.
doing a great job, my friend. You're getting across that feeling that I had when I first heard it. Some folks are commenting about your passion, and I'm glad that they're feeling the same thing that I felt when I first heard your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Local 965 loves Mike.
You ain't the only ones, Herschel. Now stop be taking that all by yourself.
Yeah, your presentation is really great. Thoroughly enjoying listening to you.
Oh, the big twist comes in the second half, so make sure you stay tuned. Is it about time to start again, Liz? I mean April.
Yep, you're ready to go. It's 10:09, my friend.
Okay, so what we were talking about in the first half was the way that civil rights groups and labor organizations came together to challenge the domination of the wealthy in the state. And so the key moment though comes with the enactment of Amendment 54 in 1964 that abolished the state's poll tax. As I suggested earlier, the poll tax was this key to elite domination of Arkansas politics. And so how does Amendment 54, how does that come about? How does it get enacted? And in order to understand that, we have to go back and we have to start with the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. I know it's been a long time since we were all in civics class, but the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax as a requirement for voting in federal elections. And it basically said that the 7 states that still had poll taxes, they had to they couldn't have a poll tax to vote for Congress, the United States Senate, or the President of the United States. And this passes Congress in September of 1962 and then goes to the states for ratification. It happened quickly. While the amendment was being ratified by the states, the Arkansas AFL-CIO, their attorney, a guy named Jim Youngdahl, drafts a model voter registration law. And its biggest thing was it was a permanent registration system, that you didn't have to register to vote every year, that once you register to vote and you can vote continuously. You don't have to go to the courthouse every year. The law also gave the power to register voters to the county clerk rather than the sheriff. It's a weird distinction I can talk about later. And the Arkansas AFL-CIO creates a committee for voter registration. The AEA was part of this. The League of Women Voters was part of this. A couple of Republican groups, because the Republicans were trying to get a foothold in the state, and they needed the entrenched Democrats to be gone. And so when the states ratified the 24th Amendment in January of 1964, Arkansas needed to change its voting laws to conform to the 24th Amendment. And when the legislature met in March, the Arkansas AFL-CIO says, here, this is what we want. This is our model legislation. This is fair, and this is just. And labor and civil rights groups, we want permanent registration, we want permanent registration, and the General Assembly ignores them. The General Assembly, beholden to these planters and the county bosses, enacts a voter law that is based upon the Alabama model, in which sheriffs register voters. You have a yearly registration. This new law that is passed by the General Assembly, if you want voting rights, a model for ideal voting rights, you don't go to Alabama in 1964. And that's what the Arkansas General Assembly did. And once this passes, organized labor, civil rights groups, they say, we are going to use the initiative process to put an end to this. We are going to use the initiative process, the one being used to, amend the Learns Act today. You'll be talking about this afternoon, this initiative process to enact permanent registration. They reorganize the Committee for Voter Registration, League of Women Voters, Young Democrats, AEA, AFL-CIO, American Association of University of Women, Young Republicans, the Republican Party. All of this is happening. And then the Supreme Court throws out, the Arkansas Supreme Court invalidates the Alabama-based Arkansas law. And what's going on? And so in November of 1964, Amendment 54, this labor, civil rights, liberal permanent registration amendment appears on the fall ballot. The planning of the campaign, organized labor, the AFL-CIO puts 95% of the money toward passage. Winthrop Rockefeller kicks in the rest. 80% of the work comes from either the AFL-CIO or AEA. A guy named H.D. Luck, Dave Luck, a physician from Arkadelphia, sort of runs it and makes it look like it's not a labor civil rights organization, a movement. And the committee collects the needed signatures, puts it on the ballot, and during the campaign, you see labor groups and civil rights groups together trying to mobilize voters to support Amendment 59. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in places like Gould, in places like Helena and Forest City is mobilizing Black voters in unprecedented numbers, using cash from the labor movement to buy poll tax receipts so that Black folks can vote. Wiley Branton leads the Arkansas, Ozell Sutton leads the Arkansas Voter Project, a part of a Southern-wide effort to increase the number of Black voters. And Ozell Sutton goes from town to town, and he increases the number of Black voters by 20,000 on the eve of the election. And what organized labor does, both white union members and Black union members, and what civil rights groups do, is they mobilize working class voters and they enact Amendment 54. And so, I should say, who opposed Amendment 54? State sheriff associations, county judges, basically the old school political bosses. Nursing home operators spend a lot of money to defeat Amendment 54. Nursing home operators would buy poll tax receipts for all of the people in the nursing homes. And the nursing home operators would then go and, have like 8,000 votes each election cycle and use that clout. The Chamber of Commerce opposed this, entrenched politicians. One of the most telling quotation comes from a legislator from Lincoln County. He told the Pine Bluff commercial why anybody could vote under permanent registration. We, meaning the old guard, would lose control. And it's quite honest. And this is, in fact, what happens. The poll tax is abolished. Arkansas is the only one of the 7 poll tax states that abolishes the poll tax entirely after the passage of the 24th Amendment. Additionally, the permanent registration system becomes a model for other states. Arkansas's voter law in 1964, NAACP, other civil rights groups point to it as what they want in other southern states. It's also telling that because of this permanent registration, no Arkansas counties come under the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Arkansas escapes all of that because it has such a progressive voting measure. And what we see is the overwhelming mass common working person support for this prevails. Lyndon Johnson, this Black Labor Coalition helps reelect Lyndon Johnson. The Great Society, the guy behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the guy who would be behind the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is Great Society, New Deal, labor liberalism. And Arkansas is one of the southern states that votes for LBJ rather than the Republican Barry Goldwater. The 1964 election really represents this first move of conservative Southerners from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And Barry Goldwater campaigns in 1964, says, I oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think these civil rights demonstrations are bad. I oppose civil rights. And conservative Southern whites flock to Barry Goldwater. This is the beginning of the change in the South. But in Arkansas, these civil rights groups, these labor unions, keep Arkansas in the LBJ, Great Society, Democratic camp. And the repeal of the poll tax, brings about the heyday of labor liberalism in the state. All of the legislation that, I mean, for instance, FOIA. We had a great FOIA law, a model FOIA law, and that was enacted in the late 1960s during this era of labor liberalism. And now it's been torn to shreds. This is when public funding for education really picks up. Higher education takes off. This is when you see the beginning of the regulation of factories for emissions, for pollution. This is when you see conservation. This is all of the things that we are proud of in the state of Arkansas come from this brief period of time. And why? Well, it's because for the first time since the 1890s, Arkansas's political system is open up to working class people. The coalition that enacted Amendment 54, permanent registration, they morph into a new organization. Same director, a guy named Dave Luck, and they're called Democrats for Arkansas. And what the Democrats for Arkansas want to do is they want to remake the Democratic Party in Arkansas like the National Democratic Party. They want it to be the party of Lyndon Johnson. They want it to be the party of civil rights. They want it to be the party of the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society says, we are such a rich nation. It is a shame. It is a crime that people continue to live in poverty. We need government programs. And what the Democrats for Arkansas, they did is they wanted to enact Great Society programs in the state, but they also wanted conservatives to leave the Democratic Party to go to the Republican, to have a viable two-party system in the state. And the Democrats for Arkansas, it's a front for labor organizations. It's a front for civil rights organizations, but they're the forces behind this. And they want constitutional reform. They want the merit system. They want civil rights legislation, minimum wages. They want to make the state of Arkansas responsible to the people. And organized labor is the great force behind this. Especially the president of the Arkansas AFL-CIO. You can see him down in this cartoon. His name is J. Bill Becker. Jerome Bill Becker. He was born in Chicago. He's Jewish, fought in World War II, and comes to the state as a union organizer after the war. And he is energetic. He is as liberal and as progressive as they come. And he becomes the major force in the Democratic Party in Arkansas. And that makes him the major force in Arkansas. And this cartoon, Blessed Be the Democrats, and it shows Bill Becker, and this is from the early 70s. He's baptizing all of the Democrats in the ways of labor liberalism. And you can see standing on the shore, Dale Bumpers and Wilbur Mills and David Pryor, Joe Purcell and Cecil Alexander, who were the leading Democratic politicians of the time. And the guy he's baptizing is Bill Clinton. This tells you how powerful organized labor was in this state. Looking at the anemic state of the Arkansas AFL-CIO right now, this is something that is just mind-boggling. And the labor liberals have some success during the Winthrop Rockefeller's 2 terms, his administration. They basically bend Winthrop Rockefeller to their will, and you get the minimum wage, you get the FOIA, you get the beginnings of all of these progressive pieces of legislation. But it continues with Dale Bumper's election in 1970. You know, Dale Bumpers came out of nowhere in 1970, came out of Charleston, Arkansas, to win the governor's office. And he, in the Democratic primary, he beat Orville Faubus. And someone asked Faubus the day after the election, hey, why did you lose to Dale Bumpers? And Faubus said, I lost because the Arkansas AFL-CIO got Dale Bumpers elected. As simple as that. In the general election, Arkansas AFL-CIO, this liberal coalition, this labor, that they got him to defeat Winthrop Rockefeller. And Bumpers comes to the governor's office in Little Rock, and he's never been in the General Assembly before. He's never run a program. He has no agenda. And he adopts the program of Democrats for Arkansas. You know, if we go back, you know, this is the labor front group. This civil rights labor organizations have this front group, Democrats for Arkansas. He takes their agenda and makes it his agenda in the General Assembly. Good government, progressive taxation, environmental regulation, business regulation. And you know, this is a picture. The cartoon on the right is I think it's from the Chamber of Commerce, and it criticizes Bumpers. It says Bumpers for governor, and the pennants, and that somehow Bill Becker is the sort of the czar, the emperor, lording over Bumpers. And there's a lot of truth to this, but also this is a deeply anti-Semitic cartoon, having the Jewish labor leaders sending right to work and business conservatives to the lions, kind of like the Christians. It's so full of hate, I guess is the best way of saying it. And so the Bumpers era is this triumph of labor liberalism, and it continued in the next governorship, David Pryor. And you can see over here in the cartoon from the Democrat Gazette on the right, you know, it's like, yeah, Pryor is labor's man. Pryor began his career as representative from Camden in the Arkansas General Assembly, worked well with organized labor. Labor helped him his election to the U.S. Congress in '66. And well, it was in fact organized labor and civil rights groups that got Pryor elected in 1966. He runs for the Senate against John McClellan, against John McClellan in '72, organized labor support, puts him there. African American support. He loses in '72, but then he becomes governor, and he continues, at least the first term, as a labor liberal. And again, you get rural health care, you get aid to senior citizens, a continuation of the types of regulation and reeling in of the excesses of plantations and business owners. You get good government. And really, you know, this is, you know, Arkansas is in the mid-1970s, the most progressive state in the South. Time Magazine runs a long story about how Arkansas is shedding its image and becoming this progressive oasis in the South. And this labor, liberal, civil rights coalition backs the emergence of Bill Clinton. As many of you know, Clinton was born down in Hope in 1946, but grew up in Hot Springs. Rhodes Scholar, Georgetown University, Yale Law School. Comes back to Arkansas. He comes to Fayetteville and teaches at law school right across from where I'm sitting right now. And in 1974, he runs for the U.S. House of Representatives. And he is the new Democratic wonder boy, as the cartoon says. And if you look at that, you know, what's Bill Clinton's weapon? He has the support of labor. And what this means is he has the support of this Black organized labor coalition. And he uses it to defeat his enemies. He loses that race in 1974. He comes close, but John Paul Hammerschmidt beats him. But even though he loses, this race enhances him. It makes him the boy wonder. And 2 years later, he runs for attorney general. And then 2 years after that, in 1978, he runs for the governor's office. And what we have in the 1970s is we have a state in which the most powerful force is organized labor. We have a labor Black political coalition that gets people elected, and we have these brilliant, charismatic, dynamic Democrats who are elected, put into office. Their campaigns are funded. The people going door to door, working on their behalf, are working people. They are teachers and they're civil rights activists. And they're seeing Arkansas being turned into this progressive state. And right now, you're probably wondering what the hell happened. And I am going to tell you, and it's not a pretty story. Those three men that you see here, the guy on the left is Dale Bumpers, the guy standing is Bill Clinton, and the guy on the right is David Pryor. In Arkansas politics, they're called the Big Three. They were the lions of the state from the 1970s, you know, and they continued in office through the 1990s. They were just never had a serious challenge, aside from 1980 for Bill Clinton, but seriously, they were all powerful. But once in office, they start rethinking. They were all brought into office by this labor Black political coalition. The civil rights groups, the labor groups were the ones knocking on doors, the ones sending them campaign contributions. It was the National AFL-CIO's political action group, COPE, that funded their campaigns. But once they're in office, their calculus changes. What they need to do to continue in office is different than what they needed to do to be elected in the first place. And what they do is they reach out to corporate interests in the state. They make alliances with the Tysons and the Waltons, the Stevens, and they find that if they want to be reelected, the best way to do that is to make sure that the Waltons and the Tysons and the Stevens and the Hussmans are not funding someone to go against them. So what they do is they move away from labor liberalism and they embrace corporate Arkansas. And they start moving away slowly. In 1976, the Arkansas AFL-CIO put on the ballot a measure to repeal the state's right to work law. And the Black Labor Coalition gets behind it. Andrew Young and Bayard Rustin even come to the state to campaign for its repeal. Bill Clinton, who ran for Congress in 1974 on the basis that he wants to change the federal law to make right to work illegal, comes out against the repeal of right to work in Arkansas. And I asked the guy who ran Clinton's campaign that year why Clinton did that. And I was told Clinton did that so that wealthy families in Northwest Arkansas would not fund someone to run against him. It's that simple. Bumpers and Pryor stayed neutral in that election to repeal right to work. They said, it's a state issue. We're not going to deal with it. And so organized labor made the elections of Bumpers and Pryor possible. Bumpers and Pryor refused to do anything to help sustain organized labor. They refused to help the institution that made their political careers possible. And they did this so that they would not alienate powerful economic interests in the state. In 1977 and 1978, Congress in Washington, D.C. was debating a federal labor reform bill to empower the labor movement. And what was happening in the 70s is that corporations like Walmart were developing more sophisticated strategies to circumvent unionism. And they were using loopholes in the law to undermine labor. If you go in 1977, 1978, Walmart used these illegal tactics. They were loophole tactics, probably illegal tactics, to defeat the Teamsters' effort to organize warehouse workers in Searcy. Anyway, in 1977, 1978, Congress was debating a bill to close these loopholes. And almost immediately, the big three announced that they opposed this bill. Governor Pryor announces his opposition. Why does Pryor oppose it? For several reasons, but most importantly, in 1978, he's planning on running for the U.S. Senate, and his two main rivals, Jim Guy Tucker and Ray Thornton, were both sitting members of Congress who had supported that bill in the House of Representatives. He saw this as a wedge issue that would allow him to gain the support of powerful corporate interests in Central Arkansas and powerful corporate interests in Northwest Arkansas. And it worked. These same corporate interests prevailed upon Dale Bumpers to join the Senate filibuster that killed that bill. Bumpers had promised labor he would not filibuster the bill, and then he does. And you can go through his papers and you can see all of the nice notes that he received from the Waltons and the Tysons and all of their promises of support in the future. It is a changing of the calculus of these three men. In 1978, David Pryor runs for the Senate against Jim Guy Tucker and Ray Thornton, and he makes his opposition to organized labor the centerpiece of his campaign. Bill Clinton, who was also elected, his career was made possible by organized labor, and a guy named Dick Morris, a political consultant. Dick Morris was so vile a human being that David Pryor's wife banned him from the governor's mansion. And Dick Morris then went on to become a Fox News conservative celebrity. But anyways, in 1978, Bill Clinton and Dick Morris write TV spots for David Pryor's Senate campaign. Basically, well, not basically, that explicitly say organized labor is bad for Arkansas. And so what you see is the big three move away from labor liberalism, and they reform the Arkansas Democratic Party into something that would be sympathetic to corporate interests. And onward, from 1978 onward, the big threes have the support of the Tysons, the Waltons, the Stevens, Walter Hussman, and his family. All of these people, all these groups of inherited wealth, they are supporting this movement away from the tenets of labor liberalism to something called neoliberalism, where it's more of a pro-corporate ideology. Remember what Ernest Green said in '67. The African Americans, humble farmers, working people needed to rally behind the labor movement, because the labor movement was the only institution that could stand up to the power of corporate America. And what the Clintons do, and what Dale Bumpers does, and what David Pryor do, is they get elected by this labor liberalism, and then once in office, they kick organized labor to the curb. They appoint a few black people to spot places in the government and ignore the needs of working class black people. And it is a new type of Democratic Party. Bill Clinton's wife joins the board of Walmart. And when she talks about this, I mean, this is the governor's wife joins the board of directors of the largest low pay corporation in America. And when she's talked about her time on the Walmart board, Hillary Clinton points out that she used her time to help women. And yes, she did. She helped break open the ranks of management in Bentonville to female attorneys and managers and accountants. But what did she do for the women who run the cash registers, the women who stock the shelves, the women who work in the warehouses? Nothing. When she means women, she means women who are of a certain economic class. She doesn't mean working class women. And in this new Bumpers Clinton Pryor ideology, the concerns of working class people, working class men and women fall by the wayside. They become, and this, their mantra, oh, I'm sorry, I did something wrong. Their mantra is, we are social liberals and economic conservatives. They are pro-business and pro-civil rights, pro-women rights, pro-abortion rights. But they are pro-business, and they turned a blind eye to the suffering of working people. And this is a new type of liberalism. It's not the liberalism of Lyndon Johnson. It's not the liberalism of Franklin Roosevelt. It is what Bill Clinton in 1992 says that he is a new kind of Democrat. And he is explicit that his Democratic Party, by making friends with the most powerful corporations in the United States, is a rejection of this past in which the Democratic Party supported organized labor. The Democratic Party supported the economic concerns of common people. And what Bill Clinton does is president, what does he do? He ends welfare as we know it. He signs trade policies. Not only NAFTA, he gives China most favored trade status. And I mean, about a month and a half ago, I drove US 64 from Bald Knob to Marion. And every town I went through had 3 or 4 factories shuttered on the side of the highway. Those jobs left because of the Clinton administration in the 1990s signing NAFTA, giving China most favorable trade status. You know, the people in Earl or the people in Augusta cannot compete against that low wage labor. And what you see is that the struggles that Arkansans are facing are rooted in this new kind of Democrat ideology. And we now live in a state in which the governor has called for a new session of the General Assembly. And in her logic, the way to help Arkansans who are struggling is to pass tax cuts that are targeted to those Arkansans who are not struggling. It makes absolutely no sense. And this is because we live in a state in which corporate interests, wealthy interests, dominate the political arena. And those people who govern, they might pay lip service to working people, but they kick them to the curb every opportunity they get. And so I guess that's a good place to stop. If there are any questions, why don't April, could you ask me, go through the chat and ask me?
Well, there's been comments, but no real questions that haven't been already answered.
Okay,
I'm
does
just gonna
anyone?
invite everybody to, if you want to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute and ask.
Normally I piss off a lot more people than this. So you guys need to step it up.
Tyler Draper says he's going to be typing a question.
Okay.
So let's give him a minute here. We've got a few comments. I see Jaquetta says, seeing where and how the Clintons function here in Arkansas definitely explains their current stance. My parents have told me stories about Clinton's presidential campaign run through Camden and what he was, quote, selling, unquote, basically.
So there's a great story. Maybe it's not great. It's kind of tragic. In 1992, when Clinton was in the Democratic primary, Bill Becker, the president of the Arkansas AFL-CIO, was just, we cannot trust Bill. telling national labor people, we cannot trust Bill Clinton. We cannot trust Bill Clinton. We cannot trust Bill Clinton. And Becker was famous for saying, Bill Clinton's a guy who will pat you on the back, piss on your leg, and you look down at your leg. He said, well, it's just raining. You know that. And Bill Becker created a 19-page, single-spaced memorandum for Lane Kirkland, president of the National AFL-CIO, listing every time Bill Clinton had betrayed working people, who would say one thing, promise one thing, and then to do the other. And Bill Becker took this to Lane Kirkland and the national folks at the AFL-CIO and said, look, Bill Clinton's not who you think he is. He talks a big game, but when push comes to shove, he will kick working people to the curb. And Lane Kirkland told Bill Becker to shut up, to be quiet, to be a good soldier and say nice things about Bill Clinton during the election. Bill Becker did that. After the election, Lane Kirkland engineered the ouster of Bill Becker as president of the Arkansas AFL-CIO. And a month later, Bill Becker dies. Just tragic.
I just had this conversation with Bill Kopsky over dinner a few weeks ago. That exact conversation.
Well, and then in the AFL-CIO headquarters in D.C., anti-Kirkland people started bid 93, 94, 95, had buttons that said Becker was right. And you know, it was like they were reviving Becker's critique of Clinton after NAFTA, after granting China the most favorable trade status.
Are you ready for Tyler's question?
Sure.
He's got an interesting one. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to leave it up to the professional, sir. Can local counties decide if they want to be a right to work or a closed shop?
Nope. Simply, the state of Arkansas bans any sort of closed shop arrangements. There are workarounds that can be done in certain industries. In the 1940s, the United Mine Workers used a state certification process as a workaround, but that's about the only example. Basically, Sid McMath arranged a workaround, but the right to work, there's very little that can be done at the local level. Any change will have to come at a national level. You know, state of Michigan last year, 2023, repealed the right to work bill. And so it can be done. Actually, I testified on behalf of the, before the Michigan Senate, talking about the origins of right to work in Arkansas.
This is an aside. I would like to have that happen before I die here in the state of Arkansas, my friend.
I would like to have it done well before then.
Okay.
But one, we need it done soon, and two,
Yes.
I hope you live a long, healthy life.
Thank you. Hey, I've got a couple of questions here for you.
Okay.
One asks, as the last or latest Arkansas Democratic governor, where does Mike Beebe stand in this succession? Or did he have a chance in the Reagan or post-Reagan era?
Beebe was a continuation of the style of bumpers prior in Clinton. I think he consciously modeled himself after that. He was a social liberal, economic conservative. You know, and if you would ask him, he would say, yes, that's what I am. And so was Mike Ross when he ran for governor against Asa Hutchinson. You know, that they are, it was part and parcel of what it meant to be. It was like Bill Clinton created a model that how to run successfully as a Democrat in the South, and you know, it works. it worked. I mean, in the 1980s and 1990s, who else were you going to vote for? Were you? Yeah, I mean, it was a brilliant political strategy, but it ended up destroying the labor movement in the South. It destroyed the very institution that allowed Bumpers and Pryor and Bill Clinton to be elected in the first place. They are politicians. There's in David Pryor's autobiography, he talks about a lesson that he learned in the 1954 gubernatorial election. He was the aide of Francis Cherry. And he said, and the lesson was, a politician's first responsibility is to be reelected. And what Pryor and what Bumpers and what Clinton did is they embodied that. They prioritized their next election over any deeper principle or policy. And when that happens, when politicians privilege their own individual success, it means that whoever has the most money to give them, that's where they'll gravitate to.
Hmm.
And so, Pryor in his autobiography was explicit. Politicians' first primary responsibility is to be reelected. Francis Cherry told him that after losing to Orville Faubus in the summer of 1954.
They say re-election starts the minute you get elected.
Yeah, well, the notion of Bill Clinton and the permanent campaign, which if you were around in the 90s like I was, that was, wow, that's so smart, but it's true.
Well, I've got a couple of comments here. Misty said the facts in the presentation that detailed justice and victory over real issues that were causing great suffering among the people of Arkansas was encouraging. So that was nice. She's reflecting on the information in the context of trauma-informed teaching and social emotional learning initiatives in the classroom, education institutions, and communities. Jessica said, history is so engaging when told as a story like this. And we have Jennifer's only lived here for 3.5, so she's enjoying the history. A lot of great job, loving the presentation. You're doing a great job. And so, yeah, I agree. But some of the facts were disconcerting at the least.
And so, I mean, I hate to say it, American democracy right now is run by corporate interests.
Yes.
It's run by money.
Mm-hmm.
We can see what powerful families did to ensure that the Learns Act would be passed.
Mm-hmm. Too bad none of us have any of that.
And it's I mean, we have to change the way we teach civics. We no longer live. I mean, we no longer live in a place in which the will of the people will triumph.
Right. Right. And that's part of our ballot initiative, is making sure that civics education is in our Constitution.
And well, it's also, I mean, it's very telling with the ballot initiative. The private schools around here all know that if it gets on the ballot, it will pass.
Right.
And so they're putting all of their eggs into hoping that not enough people sign the petition. That's their strategy. It's like when the Chamber of in what was it, 2012, 2010, there was an amendment to increase the minimum wage. The Arkansas Chamber of Commerce fought it fought it until it appeared on the ballot, and they said, once it appears on the ballot, it will win, and we're not going to waste our money.
Mhm.
You know, and so if you put progressive legislation on the ballot through direct legislation, Arkansas has proven time after time after time that we are a progressive state. There's a disconnect between the legislation on the stuff that we get through direct legislation and stuff we get through the General Assembly.
Mm.
And that is one of the reasons why conservatives want to limit the ability of Arkansans to use the initiative system or the referendum system.
Tyler says, is this our way to get back at the Waltons? Well, I say let them spend their money, but let's get those signatures.
And so, well, yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I know I went a little short, but
Oh, you're good. You're good. We started a little sooner. I didn't take as much time, so you started beforehand. What's going to happen here is we'll end up starting a little early on. We'll take a little break now, and then start a little early for Mr. Ben so that we can have a little longer lunch.
oh, everyone's in favor of longer lunch.
Well, yeah, a little longer lunch. So let's take a break, y'all, until 11:15, and then we'll have Mr. Ben come in and do his presentation. Okay, thank you so much, Michael. You're getting a lot of really good comments here, thanking you for the great information. And I want to thank you again because it was just as engaging as it was the first time I heard it. And I love the way you tell the story, and it makes it so interesting.
Well,
even though it was a little disconcerting.
Well, thanks for this opportunity. I'm always, as my wife will tell you, I'm always ready to rant. And so it gives 2 hours to rant. Okay, thanks, April. Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Liz.
All right, we are going to take a little break, y'all, until 11:15.